Catherine Wells stepped off the transport ship onto the dusty ground of Redstone Mesa and immediately felt the heat slam into her like a physical wall. The twin suns burned overhead in a sky that looked more orange than blue, and the air tasted like metal and sand. She clutched her single bag tighter and searched the crowd of rough-looking miners and workers for the man she was supposed to marry. Victor Hayes was his name, a mine owner who had paid for her passage from Earth in exchange for a marriage contract. Catherine had signed the papers 3 months ago in a cramped office in New Chicago, desperate to escape the poverty and overcrowding that made Earth feel like a prison. The recruiter had shown her pictures of Redstone Mesa, talking about opportunity and fresh starts, but standing here now, all she saw was a harsh world that looked like it wanted to kill anything soft or weak. A tall man in expensive clothing pushed through the crowd toward her. He had cold eyes and a thin mouth that seemed permanently set in a frown. 2 large men followed behind him, clearly hired muscle. Victor Hayes looked her up and down slowly, and Catherine saw his expression change from curiosity to disappointment to outright disgust. She felt her stomach drop. The journey from Earth had been long and difficult, cramped in a cargo transport with 40 other colonists. She knew she looked tired and worn, her dress wrinkled and her hair a mess despite her attempts to fix it before landing. But the way Victor looked at her made her feel like something scraped off the bottom of a boot. Victor circled her once without saying a word. Catherine tried to smile, tried to look pleasant and agreeable like the recruiter had coached her. She opened her mouth to introduce herself properly, but Victor held up one hand to silence her. He turned to one of his men and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He said she was not what he paid for, that the pictures must have been old or fake, that she looked too plain and too rough for a man of his standing. Catherine felt her face burn with humiliation as people stopped to stare. She tried to protest, pulling out her copy of the contract and pointing to the signatures, but Victor snatched the papers from her hand and tore them in half. He said the contract was void because she had misrepresented herself and that he wanted nothing to do with her. Catherine begged him to reconsider. She had nowhere else to go. No money for return passage to Earth and no way to survive on this brutal frontier world alone. Victor just laughed, a cruel sound that made her blood run cold. He told his men to take care of the problem, and before Catherine could run or scream, they grabbed her arms and dragged her away from the landing area. She fought and kicked and called for help, but the other colonists just watched or looked away. Nobody wanted to cross Victor Hayes. He owned half the settlement and most of the mines. He was the law here, or at least the closest thing to it. The men dragged Catherine through the settlement and out into the desert beyond. The red sand stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by rock formations and dead vegetation. They brought her to an old twisted tree, its branches bare and bleached white by the suns. One of the men produced heavy chains and locked them around her wrists, securing her to the trunk of the tree. Catherine screamed at them, demanding to know what they were doing, but they just followed orders without speaking. When the chains were tight and she could barely move, they stepped back. One of them almost looked sorry. The other one spit in the sand near her feet. Then they walked away, heading back toward the settlement, leaving her alone in the desert. Catherine pulled against the chains until her wrists bled. The metal was strong and the lock was solid. She was trapped. The twin suns climbed higher in the sky, and the heat became unbearable. Sweat poured down her face and soaked through her dress. She called for help until her throat was raw, but the wind just carried her voice away into the empty desert. Hours passed. The shade from the dead tree provided almost no relief. Catherine's lips cracked and her tongue felt swollen in her mouth. She had no water, no food, and no hope of rescue. Victor had made his point clear. She was a warning to other women who might come to Redstone Mesa with dreams of a better life. Those dreams died here in the desert, chained to dead trees. As the suns began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and red, Catherine felt her strength fading. The temperature dropped rapidly once darkness came, going from scorching heat to freezing cold in what felt like minutes. She shivered violently, her thin dress providing no warmth against the desert night. She thought about her life on Earth, about her mother who had died when she was young and her father who had disappeared into the lower levels of the city towers. She thought about the friends she had left behind, wondering if any of them would ever know what happened to her. She thought about all the choices that had led her to this moment, chained to a tree on a world so far from home that Earth was just another star in the sky. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to accept her fate. But then she heard footsteps crunching on the sand. Her eyes snapped open and she saw a figure approaching through the darkness. For a moment she thought Victor's men had returned to finish her off. But this person moved differently, cautious and alert. The figure got closer and she could make out more details in the dim light of Redstone Mesa's 3 moons. It was a man, tall and lean, wearing a long duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat. A cloth mask covered the lower half of his face, protection against the desert dust. He stopped a few feet away from her and stood there silently, as if trying to decide what to do. Catherine found her voice and croaked out a plea for help, and the man tilted his head slightly, considering her with eyes that looked hard and tired in the moonlight. Danny Moss had been watching the settlement from the ridge above when he saw Victor's men drag the woman out into the desert. He had tracked their movement through his scope, curious about what new cruelty Victor was inflicting on someone today. When they chained her to the old dead tree and left her there, Danny lowered his rifle and cursed under his breath. He had seen a lot of terrible things in his years on the frontier, but leaving someone to die of exposure was particularly vicious. He told himself it was not his problem, that he had enough troubles without adding a rescue mission to the list. He was wanted across 3 star systems with bounties on his head that would make most men rich for life. Every corporate security force and half the bounty hunters in the sector would love to catch Danny Moss. He turned away from the ridge and headed back toward his camp in the Canyon Networks. His crew would be waiting for him, expecting a report on the settlement's security and the timing of the next supply convoy. They had a job to plan and people depending on them. One woman chained to a tree did not change any of that. Danny walked for an hour through the rocks and sand, but he could not stop thinking about her. He kept seeing the way she had struggled against the chains, the way she had screamed for help that never came. It reminded him too much of his sister Lisa, who had died 5 years ago in a mining accident that the company had covered up. Lisa had called for help too, trapped under a cave-in with faulty equipment, but help had come too late because the company valued profit over safety. Danny stopped walking and stood still in the desert darkness. He pulled the mask down from his face and breathed the cold night air. He knew what he had to do, even though every practical part of his brain told him it was stupid. He could not save Lisa, but maybe he could save this woman. Maybe that would count for something in the grand scheme of things. He turned around and headed back toward the dead tree, moving quickly now that he had made his decision. The woman was still alive when he reached her, though she looked close to the edge. Her head was slumped forward and she was shivering so hard her chains rattled against the tree. Danny approached carefully, not wanting to startle her, but she heard his footsteps and lifted her head. Her eyes were wide with fear and hope mixed together. She tried to speak but only managed a dry croak. Danny knelt beside her and pulled a canteen from his belt. He held it to her lips and let her drink slowly. She gulped the water desperately and he had to pull it away to keep her from making herself sick. She gasped and coughed but looked at him with gratitude that made him uncomfortable. Danny examined the chains binding her wrists. They were industrial-grade security restraints, the kind used on prison transports. Victor had really wanted to make sure she could not escape. Danny reached into his coat and pulled out a small plasma cutter, a tool he had stolen from a corporate warehouse months ago. The woman watched him with growing hope as he fired up the cutter and applied it to the chain links. The plasma burned through the metal quickly, and within seconds the chains fell away. The woman collapsed forward and Danny caught her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, weakened by hours of exposure and dehydration. Danny wrapped his duster coat around her shoulders and helped her stand. She tried to walk, but her legs would not hold her. He muttered something about this being a mistake and then scooped her up in his arms. She did not protest, just rested her head against his chest and closed her eyes. Danny carried her across the desert toward the canyon entrance, moving as quickly as he could while keeping watch for any patrols or security drones. Victor's men sometimes came out this far, and Danny had no interest in a firefight while carrying an unconscious woman. The canyon networks were a maze of rock formations and old mining tunnels that stretched for miles underground. Danny knew every passage and shortcut, having used them as a base of operations for 3 years. He brought the woman to his main camp, a large cave that had been expanded and reinforced by previous miners. His crew looked up in surprise as he entered. There were 5 of them gathered around a small fire, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern when they saw the woman in his arms. Danny laid her down on a bedroll near the fire and explained what had happened. His second in command, a woman named Claire who had escaped from an indentured labor contract, just shook her head and asked if he was trying to paint a bigger target on his back. Danny admitted it was probably not his smartest move, but it was done now and they would deal with it. The woman on the bedroll stirred and opened her eyes, looking around at the cave and the people staring at her. She tried to sit up, but Claire gently pushed her back down and handed her more water along with some dried food. The woman ate slowly, and then looked at Danny with questions in her eyes. He pulled off his hat and sat down across the fire from her. He introduced himself without giving his last name and asked what her name was. She told him Catherine, and then the whole story came spilling out. The marriage contract, the journey from Earth, Victor's rejection, and the chains. Danny listened without interrupting, watching the firelight play across her face. She had been through hell in the past 24 hours, but there was still strength in her voice and defiance in her eyes. When she finished her story, she asked him why he had saved her. Danny was quiet for a long moment before answering. He told her that nobody deserved to die the way Victor had planned, alone and forgotten in the desert. Catherine studied his face and then asked what he planned to do with her now. Danny admitted he had not thought that far ahead. His crew exchanged glances, and he knew they were thinking about the complications this would bring. Catherine seemed to sense the tension and said she did not want to be a burden, that she would find her own way somehow. Danny almost laughed at that. She had no money, no skills for frontier survival, and Victor would probably kill her on sight if she went back to the settlement. He told her she could stay with them for now, at least until they figured out a better plan. His crew did not look thrilled, but they did not argue. They had all been saved by Danny at one point or another, refugees from the corporate system that ground people into dust. Catherine nodded slowly and wrapped the duster coat tighter around herself. She looked exhausted but also relieved to have somewhere safe to rest. Danny stood up and told everyone to get some sleep. They had work to do in the morning, and now they had an extra mouth to feed. Catherine woke up the next morning stiff and sore, her wrists still aching from the chains. She sat up on the bedroll and looked around the cave that was now her shelter. The other members of Danny's crew were already awake, preparing food and checking weapons. They moved with practiced efficiency, and Catherine felt utterly useless watching them. She had come to Redstone Mesa expecting to be a wife, to manage a household and maybe help with administrative work. Instead, she was hiding in a cave with outlaws who stole from corporate convoys. Danny approached her with a plate of reconstituted eggs and some kind of protein bar. The food tasted bland, but Catherine ate it gratefully. Danny sat down beside her and explained the situation more clearly in the morning light. He and his crew were wanted criminals, though he preferred to think of themselves as freedom fighters. They raided supply shipments that were meant for corporate executives and distributed the goods to the workers and families struggling in the settlement. Catherine listened and asked why they did not just leave Redstone Mesa if things were so bad. Danny's expression hardened and he told her that running away did not fix anything. Someone had to stand up to the corporations that treated human lives like disposable resources. Catherine argued that what he was doing was still theft, that there were legal ways to fight injustice. Danny laughed bitterly at that. He asked her what legal options existed on a world where the corporations owned the courts, the security forces, and even the colonial government. Catherine fell silent because she did not have a good answer. She had grown up on Earth believing in systems and rules, but those systems had failed her too. Still, she could not shake the feeling that there must be a better way than hiding in caves and stealing supplies. Over the next few days, Catherine tried to make herself useful despite having no real skills for outlaw life. She helped sort through stolen supplies, cleaned weapons she barely understood how to use, and tried to learn the layout of the canyon networks. The crew tolerated her presence but kept their distance. Claire was the only one who showed any real kindness, teaching Catherine basic survival skills and explaining how the crew operated. Catherine learned that everyone here had a story similar to hers. They had all been broken by the corporate system in one way or another and had nowhere else to turn. Danny kept his distance from Catherine, which frustrated her more than she wanted to admit. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, but whenever she tried to talk to him beyond basic necessities, He found an excuse to leave. Catherine wondered if he regretted saving her. She cornered him one evening, as he was preparing for a scouting mission, and demanded to know why he was avoiding her. Danny seemed surprised by her directness. He told her he was not avoiding her, just busy keeping everyone alive. Catherine did not believe him and said so. Danny's jaw tightened, and he finally admitted that having her around complicated things, that he had made an impulsive decision to save her, and now his crew was at greater risk because of it. The words stung even though Catherine understood the logic behind them. She told Danny she never asked to be saved, that she would leave if she was such a burden. Danny grabbed her arm gently and said she would not survive a day on her own out there. They stood there in tense silence for a moment before Danny released her and walked away without another word. Catherine wanted to scream in frustration. She had traded one impossible situation for another, and she was tired of feeling helpless. The turning point came a week after Danny had rescued her. The crew was planning a raid on a corporate supply depot that held medical supplies desperately needed by families in the settlement. Children were dying from treatable illnesses because the corporation that owned the depot charged prices that workers could never afford. Danny explained the plan during a meeting in the main cave, laying out guard positions and security systems on a hand-drawn map. Catherine listened intently and then pointed out a flaw in their approach. The depot would have backup security protocols that activated if the main systems were tampered with. Danny asked how she knew that, and Catherine explained that she had worked in logistics coordination on Earth before losing her job. She understood how corporate supply chains operated. Danny and Claire exchanged glances. Danny asked Catherine if she could help them bypass those security protocols. Catherine hesitated because helping them meant fully committing to their cause, crossing a line from victim to active participant. But then she thought about the children dying in the settlement, about Victor Hayes sitting in his comfortable compound while people suffered, about all the ways the system had failed everyone she had met here. She nodded and said she would help. The crew's attitude toward Catherine shifted after that. She was no longer just dead weight that Danny had picked up out of misplaced sympathy. She was a resource, someone with knowledge they needed. Catherine spent the next 2 days working with Danny to refine the raid plan. They sat together in the cave, going over details and discussing alternatives. Danny told her more about his sister Lisa and how her death had changed him. Catherine shared more about her life on Earth, the grinding poverty, and the desperate hope that had led her to sign a marriage contract with a stranger. During one of these planning sessions, Danny looked at Catherine and said she was stronger than he had initially given her credit for. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. She told Danny he was not as hard and cold as he pretended to be. Danny smiled slightly, a rare expression that made him look younger and less burdened. For a moment, the walls between them came down, and Catherine felt a connection that went beyond circumstance and necessity. But the moment was interrupted by one of the crew running into the cave with urgent news. Victor Hayes had put out a massive bounty on Danny's head, using Catherine's supposed kidnapping as justification. He was claiming that Danny had abducted an innocent woman and was holding her hostage. Corporate security forces were sweeping the canyon networks with new equipment and more personnel than ever before. The crew would have to move their base camp immediately. Catherine felt guilt wash over her. Danny had been right about her complicating things. Her presence had given Victor the excuse he needed to escalate his hunt for the outlaws. She started to apologize, but Danny cut her off. He said Victor would have found some excuse eventually, that this just moved up their timeline. They needed to execute the medical supply raid as soon as possible, then find a new hiding place deeper in the canyons. Catherine asked if he wanted her to stay behind, and Danny looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He said he needed her on the raid because her knowledge might be the difference between success and failure. More importantly, he trusted her, and trust was hard to come by in his world. Catherine nodded, feeling something shift between them, a bond forged in shared danger and mutual respect. The corporate supply depot sat on the eastern edge of the settlement, a squat concrete building surrounded by security fences and surveillance equipment. Danny's crew approached under cover of darkness, using the shadows of nearby mining equipment to conceal their movements. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind a rusted excavator, watching Danny signal positions to the rest of the team. She had never done anything like this before, and the reality of what they were about to do hit her with full force. This was not just planning anymore. This was real and dangerous and possibly deadly. Danny appeared beside her, his face barely visible in the darkness. He handed her a small device that looked like a modified data pad and reminded her of her role. Catherine would access the depot's external security terminal and create a false alarm on the opposite side of the building, drawing guards away from their entry point. Meanwhile, Danny and 2 others would breach the main door and secure the medical supplies. Claire and the remaining crew member would provide lookout and cover fire if things went wrong. The plan was simple but relied on precise timing. Catherine crawled forward toward the security terminal mounted on the fence perimeter. Her hands shook as she connected her device to the terminal port. The interface was similar to systems she had worked with on Earth, but with enough differences to make her nervous. She navigated through the menus, searching for the alarm controls while keeping one eye on the guard patrol walking the fence line. The guard passed within 10 feet of her hiding spot, and Catherine held her breath, pressing herself flat against the ground. After what felt like an eternity, the guard moved on and Catherine returned to her work. She found the alarm system and began programming the false alert. Just as Danny had warned her about, backup protocols activated as soon as she tried to modify the primary settings. Catherine's training kicked in, and she quickly routed the backup through a dummy channel, making the system think it was responding to a legitimate threat. An alarm began blaring on the far side of the depot, and Catherine saw guards running toward the sound. She signaled Danny that the path was clear. Danny and his team moved fast using a plasma cutter on the main door lock. They disappeared inside the depot, and Catherine waited in tense silence. Seconds felt like hours. She monitored the security system, watching as the guards investigated the false alarm. Any moment now they would realize it was a fake and return to their posts. Catherine started counting in her head, trying to estimate how much time Danny had before everything went wrong. Movement caught her eye, and Catherine looked up to see a guard returning earlier than expected. He was walking directly toward the main entrance where Danny had gone in. Catherine made a split-second decision and triggered another alarm, this one in a different section of the depot. The guard paused, confused by the multiple alerts, then turned to investigate the new sound. Catherine let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Then everything went wrong at once. The depot's automated defense systems activated, something that should not have been possible with Catherine's bypass in place. Searchlights flooded the area and automated turrets deployed from hidden panels. Catherine heard shouting from inside the depot and the sharp crack of gunfire. Danny and his team came running out carrying boxes of medical supplies, but guards were right behind them. Claire opened fire from her position, providing cover as the team ran for the extraction point. Catherine grabbed her weapon, a pistol that Danny had insisted she carry despite her protests that she did not know how to use it. A guard spotted her hiding place and raised his rifle. Catherine did not think, just pointed and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked the gun from her hand, but the shot went wide, missing the guard but making him dive for cover. It gave Danny's team the seconds they needed to reach the extraction vehicles, converted mining crawlers that could navigate the rough desert terrain. Danny shouted for Catherine to run, and she did, abandoning the security terminal and sprinting toward the nearest crawler. Bullets kicked up sand around her feet, and she heard the whine of energy weapons heating the air near her head. Someone grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. It was Danny, providing covering fire with one hand while dragging her toward safety with the other. They reached the crawler and tumbled inside as Claire gunned the engine. The vehicle lurched forward, crashing through the perimeter fence and racing into the desert. But they were not safe yet. 2 security vehicles emerged from the depot garage and gave chase, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Danny moved to the rear of the crawler and opened fire on their pursuers. The other crew members did the same, turning the desert into a chaotic firefight. Catherine pressed herself against the wall of the crawler, her ears ringing from the noise and her body shaking with adrenaline. One of the security vehicles took a direct hit and spun out, crashing into a rock formation. The other kept coming, gaining on them. Danny cursed and told Claire to take evasive maneuvers. The crawler swerved hard and Catherine was thrown against the side wall. She looked up and saw a guard leaning out of the pursuing vehicle, aiming what looked like a rocket launcher. She screamed a warning, but it was too late. The guard fired and the rocket streaked toward them. Danny threw himself on top of Catherine as the explosion rocked the crawler. Shrapnel tore through the rear panels, but somehow the vehicle stayed upright. Claire pushed the engine to maximum and they pulled ahead of the damaged security vehicle, which fell behind and eventually gave up the chase. The crew let out ragged cheers as they entered the canyon networks where the larger security vehicles could not follow. Catherine realized Danny was still lying on top of her, his body shielding hers from the blast. She could feel his heart pounding and his breath coming fast. Their eyes met in the dim light of the crawler, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of how close they had both come to dying. Danny slowly moved off her and helped her sit up. He asked if she was hurt, and Catherine shook her head, though her whole body felt like one giant bruise. The crawler navigated through the twisting canyons and finally reached a hidden cave entrance. The crew unloaded the medical supplies, dozens of boxes containing antibiotics, painkillers, and other essential medicines. Despite the danger and the close calls, the raid had been a success. Claire counted the boxes and announced they had enough supplies to help hundreds of families. The crew celebrated quietly, exhausted but satisfied. Danny found Catherine sitting alone near the cave entrance, looking out at the desert landscape. He sat down beside her and they were silent for a while. Then Catherine turned to him and said she had shot at someone tonight, had participated in a raid and helped steal from a corporation. Danny asked if she regretted it. Catherine thought about the question carefully. A week ago she would have said yes without hesitation, but now, thinking about the children who would live because of the medicine they had stolen, thinking about the families who would not have to watch their loved ones die from treatable diseases, she found she did not regret it at all. She told Danny that being chained to that tree had been the worst moment of her life, but maybe it was also the moment everything changed for the better. If Victor had accepted her, she would have spent her life as the wife of a cruel man, probably ignorant of all the suffering happening around her. Instead, she was here with people who fought for something bigger than themselves. Danny smiled and said she had saved his life tonight by spotting that guard. Catherine said he had saved hers by throwing himself on top of her during the explosion. They were even now. Danny's expression grew serious and he told Catherine that things were going to get worse before they got better. Victor would escalate after this raid, bringing in more security and possibly even mercenaries. The crew would have to be more careful and take greater risks. Catherine could still walk away if she wanted, try to make peace with Victor or find passage off Redstone Mesa. Catherine looked at Danny and saw the hope and fear mixed in his eyes. She realized he did not want her to leave, and more surprising, she did not want to leave either. She told him she was staying, that she had found something worth fighting for. Danny reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. They sat together watching the moons rise over the desert, both knowing their lives had become irrevocably intertwined. Victor Hayes stood in his office overlooking the settlement and slammed his fist on the desk hard enough to make his assistant flinch. The medical supply raid had cost him money and reputation, but worse, it had made him look weak. People in the settlement were whispering about Danny Moss and his crew, treating them like heroes instead of the criminals they were. Victor could not allow that to continue. He reached for his communication device and made a call to someone he had hoped never to use. When the line connected, Victor spoke clearly and without emotion. He wanted Kane Fletcher, and he wanted him now. Kane Fletcher arrived on Redstone Mesa 3 days later on a private transport that landed at Victor's personal pad. He was a tall man with cold gray eyes and a face that showed no expression. He had been a military operative during the colony wars, specializing in hunting down deserters and rebels. Now he worked freelance for whoever paid his considerable fees. Victor met him in the office and laid out the situation. Kane listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing at the files Victor provided on Danny Moss and his crew. When Victor finished, Kane named his price. Victor did not even blink before agreeing. Money meant nothing if he could not maintain control of his territory. Danny's crew learned about Kane Fletcher from their contacts in the settlement. The news spread fear through the group faster than any security force could. Everyone who operated on the frontier knew Kane's reputation. He did not just catch his targets. He made examples of them. Claire called an emergency meeting in the main cave and voiced what everyone was thinking. They needed to leave Redstone Mesa immediately, scatter to different systems, and start over somewhere Kane could not find them. Some of the crew agreed loudly, fear evident in their voices. Danny listened to the arguments but shook his head. He said running would only delay the inevitable. Kane was the type who would hunt them across the galaxy if paid enough. Besides, leaving meant abandoning all the families and workers who depended on them for supplies and protection. Catherine spoke up, surprising everyone. She said they needed to think strategically instead of just reacting in fear. If Kane was hunting them, they needed to understand his methods and find a way to turn his strengths against him. The debate continued for hours. Some crew members accused Catherine of not understanding how dangerous Kane was, that her inexperience would get them all killed. Others pointed out that she had been right about the security systems during the raid, that maybe fresh perspective was exactly what they needed. Danny finally ended the discussion by saying they would stay, but increase their security measures and move to a backup camp deeper in the canyons. The decision was made, but the tension remained thick in the air. That night, Catherine could not sleep. She walked through the cave passages and found Danny standing watch at the entrance. She joined him, and they looked out at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Catherine asked Danny if he thought she had spoken out of turn during the meeting. Danny said she had every right to voice her opinion, that she was part of the crew now whether some people liked it or not. Catherine appreciated the support, but she could see the weight of leadership pressing down on Danny. He was responsible for every person in that cave, and the arrival of Kane Fletcher had made that burden much heavier. Catherine did something she had been thinking about for days. She told Danny she wanted to turn herself in to Victor. The plan had been forming in her mind since she learned about Kane. If she went back to Victor and claimed Danny had held her prisoner, it might satisfy Victor's pride and draw attention away from the rest of the crew. Danny's reaction was immediate and fierce. He said absolutely not, that returning to Victor would be a death sentence or worse. Catherine argued that her life was worth less than the lives of everyone in the crew. But Danny grabbed her shoulders and said her life was worth just as much as anyone else's, that he would not let her sacrifice herself. The intensity in Danny's voice made Catherine's breath catch. She asked him why he cared so much about what happened to her. Danny was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on her shoulders. Then he admitted that somewhere between rescuing her from that tree and watching her risk her life during the raid, she had become important to him, not just another person to protect, but someone he cared about deeply. Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes. She told Danny that she cared about him too, that the thought of him being caught by Kane terrified her more than anything else. They stood close together in the darkness, and then Danny leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but Catherine responded by wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and for a few perfect moments, the danger and fear faded away. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Danny rested his forehead against Catherine's and whispered that they would find a way through this together, that he was not going to lose her. The peaceful moment shattered when an explosion rocked the cave entrance. Alarms that the crew had set up began wailing, and Claire's voice echoed through the passages shouting that they were under attack. Danny and Catherine ran back into the main cave where the crew was grabbing weapons and supplies. Kane Fletcher had found them faster than anyone expected, and his team of mercenaries was assaulting the cave entrance with heavy weapons. Danny shouted orders to evacuate through the back tunnels, while he and two others held the entrance. Catherine refused to leave him, but he physically pushed her toward the evacuation route and told her to go. The sound of gunfire filled the cave as Kane's mercenaries breached the entrance. Catherine ran with Claire and three other crew members through the winding back tunnels, carrying what supplies they could grab. Behind them, the sounds of battle echoed through the rock. They emerged from a hidden exit on the far side of the canyon and regrouped in the darkness. Claire did a quick head count, and Catherine's heart sank when she realized Danny was not with them. Neither were the two who had stayed to cover the retreat. Claire said they had to keep moving, that Kane's people would be searching for other exits. Catherine wanted to go back, but Claire grabbed her arm and said Danny had stayed behind so the rest of them could escape, and going back would make his sacrifice meaningless. The group moved through the canyons in silence, heading for an emergency shelter that only the core crew knew about. It was a small cave barely large enough for all of them, stocked with minimal supplies. They huddled together in the darkness and waited. Hours passed with no sign of Danny or the others. Catherine sat with her back against the cold rock wall, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. She thought about the kiss they had shared, about Danny's promise that they would get through this together. and wondered if those would be the last words they ever spoke to each other. Just before dawn, they heard footsteps outside the shelter. Everyone raised their weapons, expecting Kane's mercenaries. But it was Danny who stumbled through the entrance, bleeding from a wound in his side and supported by one of the crew members who had stayed with him. The other had not made it. Catherine rushed to Danny and helped lower him to the ground. He was pale and clearly in pain, but he was alive. She pressed her hands against his wound to stop the bleeding while Claire searched their medical supplies for something to help. Danny looked up at Catherine and managed a weak smile. He said Kane's team was good, but they had underestimated how well the crew knew the cave systems. He and the others had collapsed several tunnels behind them and escaped through passages too narrow for Kane's heavily armored mercenaries to follow. The victory was small and costly, but they had survived. Catherine worked to bandage Danny's wound while fighting back tears. She told him he was an idiot for staying behind like that. Danny said he was an idiot about a lot of things, but keeping her safe was not one of them. Claire interrupted to say they could not stay here long. Kane would have trackers, and eventually he would find this shelter too. They needed a new plan, and they needed it fast because running was no longer an option. Danny's wound kept him immobilized for 2 days while the crew stayed hidden in the emergency shelter. Catherine barely left his side, changing his bandages and making sure infection did not set in. The supplies Claire had grabbed during the evacuation included basic medical equipment, enough to keep Danny stable, but not enough to properly treat his injury. He needed real medical attention, but going to the settlement was impossible with Kane's mercenaries everywhere. On the 3rd day, Danny was strong enough to sit up and participate in the crew's strategy discussions. The situation was dire. They had lost most of their supplies, their main base, and 1 crew member. Kane Fletcher was systematically searching the canyon networks with technology that made their old hiding spots useless. Meanwhile, Victor had increased his propaganda campaign in the settlement, painting Danny as a dangerous terrorist who had kidnapped an innocent woman and was holding her against her will. Posters with Catherine's face were plastered everywhere, offering a reward for her safe return. Claire argued again for scattering and leaving Redstone Mesa. The crew could split up, change their identities, and disappear into the frontier. Danny understood the logic, but he also knew it meant abandoning everything they had built and everyone who depended on them. He asked if anyone had a better idea. The cave fell silent. Catherine had been thinking constantly during the past 2 days, turning over possibilities in her mind. She finally spoke up with a plan that made everyone stare at her like she had lost her mind. She proposed contacting Victor directly and offering to return to him. But instead of genuinely surrendering, she would wear a hidden recording device and get Victor to confess his crimes on tape. Victor's pride and cruelty would be his weakness. If they could get proof of his illegal activities and his order to leave her chained in the desert to die, they could expose him to the colonial authorities and the off-world media. Public outrage might force real changes on Redstone Mesa and remove Victor's protection. Danny's immediate reaction was to refuse outright. He said the plan put Catherine in too much danger, that Victor would likely kill her the moment he had her back. Catherine argued that Victor needed her alive to maintain his victim narrative. If she died, he could not play the hero rescuing his kidnapped bride. She would be safer in Victor's compound than any of them were hiding in the canyons. The real risk was whether they could get the evidence they needed before Victor figured out the deception. The crew debated for hours. Some supported Catherine's plan as their best chance for a real solution, instead of just running away. Others insisted it was too risky, and that they should not bet everything on such a dangerous gamble. Claire pointed out that even if they got evidence against Victor, there was no guarantee the colonial authorities would act on it. Corruption ran deep on frontier worlds. Danny listened to all the arguments, but his eyes kept returning to Catherine. She sat calmly despite everyone talking about her like she was a piece on a game board. Finally, Danny asked to speak with Catherine alone. They walked a short distance from the shelter into the canyon. The twin suns were setting, painting the rocks in shades of orange and purple. Danny told Catherine that her plan might work, but it also might get her killed, and he could not bear the thought of losing her. Catherine took his hands and said she understood the risk, but she had been thinking about more than just survival. She wanted to actually fix the problem, to make Redstone Mesa a place where people like her did not get thrown away when they were no longer useful. Danny pulled her close and held her tightly, He admitted he was terrified of letting her go, that these past weeks with her had changed something fundamental in him. Catherine rested her head against his chest and said she felt the same way. She told him that when she was chained to that tree waiting to die, she had given up on the idea that her life could matter. But Danny had shown her that every life mattered, that standing up against cruelty and injustice was worth the risk. Now she wanted to fight not just for survival but for something better. They kissed as the suns disappeared below the horizon. Danny whispered that he loved her, words he had not spoken to anyone since his sister died. Catherine said she loved him too, and that after this was over, she wanted to build a real life with him. Danny made her promise to be careful, to get out at the first sign of real danger. Catherine promised, though they both knew promises like that were hard to keep in situations like this. The crew spent the next day preparing for the plan. They had one working communication device that had not been destroyed during the evacuation. Catherine composed a message to Victor, carefully crafting the words to appeal to his ego. She claimed that Danny had held her prisoner, but she had managed to escape during the chaos of Kane's attack. She was alone and frightened in the desert and needed Victor to rescue her. She provided coordinates for a meeting point, an abandoned mining station halfway between the settlement and the canyon networks. Before sending the message, Danny gave Catherine a tiny recording device that one of the crew members had modified. It was disguised as a piece of jewelry, a small pendant that would record both audio and video. Catherine tucked it inside her dress where it would not be easily found. Danny also gave her a tracker, warning her that if she was in serious danger they would come for her regardless of the plan. Catherine nodded and tried to memorize every detail of Danny's face just in case this was the last time she saw him. They sent the message and waited. Victor's response came within an hour. He agreed to meet Catherine at the mining station but insisted she come alone and unarmed. If he detected any sign of Danny or his crew, the deal was off. Catherine sent confirmation and then prepared to leave. Claire gave her some advice on how to act scared and vulnerable, how to play into Victor's need to feel powerful and in control. Catherine listened carefully, knowing her performance would need to be convincing. The night before the meeting, Catherine could not sleep. She lay in the shelter thinking about all the ways the plan could go wrong. Danny was awake too, she could tell by his breathing. She moved closer to him and he wrapped his arm around her. They talked quietly about what they would do after this was over. Danny said he wanted to leave Redstone Mesa and find a world where they could start fresh, maybe open a supply business that actually helped people instead of exploiting them. Catherine said she wanted that too, a simple life without running or hiding. But they also talked about staying if the plan worked. If Victor was exposed and real reforms came to Redstone Mesa, someone would need to make sure those reforms actually happened. Danny and Catherine could be part of building something better from the ruins of the old corrupt system. The conversation drifted between hope and fear, between dreams of the future and worries about the present. Morning came too quickly. Catherine dressed in the cleanest clothes they had, trying to look like someone who had been held prisoner and had barely escaped. Danny walked with her to the edge of the canyon where a small vehicle waited, one of the few pieces of equipment they had managed to save. Before she climbed in, Danny kissed her one more time and told her to come back to him. Catherine promised she would try. She drove away from the canyons toward the abandoned mining station, leaving behind the only safety she had known since arriving on Redstone Mesa. As she drove, Catherine thought about how much her life had changed. Weeks ago, she had been a desperate woman hoping a marriage contract would save her. Now she was driving toward possible death to try to save others. She touched the recording pendant and thought about all the people who would benefit if this plan worked. Children who needed medicine, workers who deserved fair treatment, families who should not have to live in fear. Catherine realized that whether she survived this or not, she was finally doing something that mattered. That knowledge gave her courage as the abandoned mining station appeared on the horizon, and she saw Victor's vehicles waiting for her. The weeks following the confrontation at the mining station transformed Redstone Mesa in ways nobody had anticipated. Victor Hayes was arrested trying to flee off-world with as much wealth as he could carry. The colonial marshal, finally free from Victor's influence and pressured by off-world media attention, charged him with fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, labor violations, and a dozen other crimes. The trial became a sensation across the frontier colonies, a rare example of corporate power actually being held accountable. Catherine testified at the trial, standing in front of the colonial court and telling her story. She described arriving on Redstone Mesa full of hope, being rejected and chained to a tree to die, and everything that followed. The courtroom was packed with workers and families who had suffered under Victor's rule. When Catherine finished her testimony, the room erupted in applause despite the judge's attempts to maintain order. Victor sat at the defense table looking smaller than Catherine remembered, his power stripped away by the truth. Danny also testified, explaining why he had become an outlaw and detailing the corporate abuses that had driven him to it. He spoke about his sister Lisa and the mining accident that had killed her, an accident caused by faulty equipment that the company had known about but refused to fix because repairs cost money. His words resonated with everyone in the courtroom who had lost someone to corporate negligence. The trial lasted 3 weeks and ended with Victor Hayes being sentenced to 20 years in a frontier prison. His assets were seized and redistributed to compensate his victims. But the trial was only part of the change sweeping through Redstone Mesa. The workers, emboldened by Victor's fall, organized themselves and demanded reforms. They wanted fair contracts, safety regulations, and a voice in how the settlement was run. The colonial government, aware that the whole frontier was watching, had no choice but to negotiate. Claire took a leading role in these negotiations, her experience with labor issues making her an effective advocate. Danny supported her but stayed in the background, uncomfortable with the attention. Catherine found herself becoming a symbol for people across the frontier, the rejected bride who had refused to accept her fate and had helped bring down a corrupt system. Media outlets wanted interviews. Other settlements invited her to speak about workers' rights and corporate accountability. She declined most of these requests, uncomfortable with fame and preferring to focus on practical work. She helped establish a support network for people coming to Redstone Mesa on contract marriages or labor agreements, making sure they understood their rights and had resources if things went wrong. 6 months after Victor's arrest, Redstone Mesa held its first free elections for a colonial council that would have real power to govern and regulate corporate activities. Claire ran for a seat and won by a landslide. Danny finally accepted amnesty from the colonial government in exchange for his testimony and his agreement to work with the new council on security matters. The outlaw became a legitimate protector of the people he had always fought for. Catherine and Danny moved out of the caves and into a small house on the edge of the settlement. It was modest, but it was theirs, the first real home either of them had known in years. They furnished it slowly with things salvaged from abandoned buildings and items gifted by grateful families. Catherine found work helping the new council organize supply chains and logistics, using her skills from Earth to make sure resources were distributed fairly. Danny worked with the colonial marshal to train a new security force, one that answered to the people rather than corporate interests. The dead tree where Catherine had been chained was removed by volunteers from the settlement. In its place, they planted the first living tree on Redstone Mesa, a sapling brought from off-world and carefully tended in specially prepared soil. It was a small thing, fragile and vulnerable in the harsh desert environment, but it represented hope. Catherine and Danny attended the planting ceremony along with hundreds of others. As they watched the sapling being lowered into the ground, Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. She had come to this world expecting to be a bride and had nearly died in the desert. Instead, she had become part of something much more important. Danny took her hand and squeezed it gently. He asked if she ever regretted how things had turned out, if she ever wished she had made different choices. Catherine looked at the small tree, at the people gathered around it, at the settlement that was slowly transforming from a corporate outpost into a real community. She told Danny she regretted nothing. Being rejected and left to die had been the worst and best thing that ever happened to her. It had destroyed her old life but allowed her to build a new one, a life that mattered. That evening, Danny and Catherine sat on the porch of their house watching the twin suns set over the desert. The temperature dropped quickly as it always did, but Catherine had learned to love these moments when the harsh heat gave way to cool darkness. Danny wrapped a blanket around both of them and pulled her close. He said he had been thinking about the future, about what they wanted to do next. Catherine asked what he had in mind. Danny admitted he still wanted to see the frontier, to explore the worlds beyond Redstone Mesa. But he wanted to do it right this time, not as a fugitive, but as a free man. Maybe they could start that supply business he had mentioned, traveling between settlements and helping people get what they needed without exploitation. Catherine loved the idea. She said they should finish the work here first, make sure the reforms were solid and the new system was stable. Then they could go adventuring together. They talked late into the night about planets they wanted to visit and things they wanted to do. Catherine mentioned Earth and wondered if she should go back and visit, show Danny where she came from. Danny said he would go with her if she wanted, though he had no love for the overcrowded core worlds. Catherine decided she was not ready to return to Earth yet. Too many painful memories lived there. Maybe someday, but not now. A year after Victor's trial, Catherine stood in the settlement square during the anniversary celebration of what people were calling Liberation Day. The settlement had changed dramatically in 12 months. New buildings had been constructed with better materials and proper planning. The mines operated under strict safety regulations and workers received fair compensation. Families no longer feared arbitrary punishment or contract violations. Children played in streets that had once been dangerous, their laughter a sound that had been rare before. Catherine gave a short speech at the celebration, thanking everyone who had fought for change and reminding them that the work was never truly done. Freedom required constant vigilance and effort. People cheered, and the celebration continued with music and food. Danny found Catherine in the crowd and led her away from the noise to a quiet spot where they could watch without being the center of attention. Catherine leaned against Danny and thought about how far they had both come. She had arrived on Redstone Mesa as a desperate woman seeking security through marriage to a stranger. She had been rejected, left for dead, and forced to find strength she did not know she possessed. Danny had been a bitter outlaw driven by grief and anger. Together they had found something neither expected, love and purpose and a reason to fight for something bigger than themselves. The small tree planted where Catherine had been chained was growing slowly but surely. Someone had built a protective barrier around it and people took turns watering it and caring for it. The tree had become a symbol of Redstone Mesa's transformation, proof that even in the harshest conditions, life could take root and flourish. Catherine visited the tree regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with Danny. She would touch its thin trunk and remember the terror of those hours spent chained and dying, and then she would look at what had grown from that darkness. 2 years after her arrival on Redstone Mesa, Catherine and Danny prepared for their first journey off-world together. They had saved enough money to book passage on a transport heading toward the outer colonies. The new council was stable and functioning well. Claire had been re-elected and had things well in hand. It was time for Catherine and Danny to explore the frontier and maybe help other settlements learn from Redstone Mesa's example. The morning of their departure, they visited the tree one last time. It was taller now, its branches spreading wider, its leaves a shocking green against the red desert landscape. Other trees had been planted around it, the beginning of a small park that the settlement hoped to expand. Children played among the saplings, and Catherine smiled at the sight. This was the future they had fought for, a world where children could grow up with hope instead of fear. Danny asked if she was ready to go. Catherine nodded. She was ready for whatever came next. They walked hand in hand to the transport station, carrying light bags that held everything they owned. People called out goodbyes and good wishes. Catherine waved to Claire and the other council members. She promised to stay in touch and return to visit. As the transport lifted off and Redstone Mesa shrank below them, Catherine looked down at the settlement one last time. She could see the small patch of green where the trees grew, a spot of life in the desert that had almost claimed her. The abandoned mining station looked like a skeleton against the orange sky, all rusted metal and broken windows. Catherine parked her vehicle and stepped out, her legs shaking despite her efforts to appear calm. Victor's convoy consisted of 3 large transports and at least a dozen armed guards. She recognized Kane Fletcher standing near the center vehicle, his gray eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of an ambush. Victor himself emerged from the lead transport, dressed in expensive clothing that looked absurd in the desert setting. Catherine walked forward slowly, playing her role. She had rehearsed this in her mind 100 times during the drive. She needed to seem frightened and grateful, desperate for Victor's protection. She called out to him, her voice deliberately weak and trembling. Victor approached her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He opened his arms as if to embrace her, but Catherine noticed he stopped just short of actually touching her. He was examining her, looking for weapons or signs of deception. Victor spoke loudly enough for his guards to hear, saying he was so relieved she had escaped from that monster Danny Moss. He asked if she had been hurt, if Danny had mistreated her. Catherine nodded and launched into a fabricated story about being held prisoner in caves, about fearing for her life every day. She made sure the recording device captured every word Victor said in response. He played along perfectly, expressing outrage at her treatment and promising that Danny would pay for his crimes. But then Victor's expression changed. He told his guards to search her for tracking devices. Catherine's heart raced as rough hands patted her down, checking for weapons and technology. They found the tracker Danny had given her almost immediately. Victor held it up and his smile turned cruel. He said he knew Danny would not let her go without some way to follow her. He crushed the tracker under his boot and told Catherine she had disappointed him again. Catherine tried to maintain her act, claiming she had not known about the tracker, that Danny must have planted it without her knowledge. Victor laughed and said he did not believe her. He had agreed to this meeting not because he wanted her back, but because he wanted to use her as bait. Kane Fletcher stepped forward and explained that his team had followed Catherine from the canyons and now had the location of Danny's hiding spot. They would attack at dawn and finally end this problem permanently. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had led them straight to Danny and the crew. The plan had failed before it even really started. Victor saw the horror on her face and seemed to enjoy it. He told her she would watch Danny die, and then Victor would decide what to do with her. Perhaps he would keep her as a servant, a reminder of what happened to people who defied him. Perhaps he would just leave her chained to another tree. Catherine's fear turned to anger. She stopped playing the victim and stood straighter, meeting Victor's eyes with defiance. She told him he was a coward who only felt powerful when crushing people weaker than himself. Victor's face flushed red and he raised his hand to strike her. But before he could, an explosion rocked the far side of the mining station. Then another. Danny and his crew had not waited for dawn. They had followed Catherine despite the plan, unwilling to leave her alone with Victor. The mining station erupted into chaos. Victor's guards scattered, trying to identify where the attacks were coming from. Kane Fletcher shouted orders and organized a defensive perimeter. Catherine took advantage of the confusion and ran, diving behind a stack of old mining equipment. Gunfire echoed across the desert as Danny's crew engaged Victor's forces from multiple positions. Catherine spotted Danny moving through the ruins of the station, his rifle raised and firing with precise aim. She wanted to call out to him but knew it would give away his position. Instead, she looked for a weapon, anything she could use. She found a piece of metal pipe and gripped it tightly. A guard appeared around the corner and Catherine swung the pipe with all her strength, connecting with his knee. The guard went down and Catherine grabbed his weapon, a pistol similar to the one Danny had given her. She moved through the station trying to reach Danny, but Victor found her first. He grabbed her from behind and pressed a knife to her throat. He dragged her into the open and shouted for Danny to stop fighting or he would kill Catherine. The gunfire slowed and then stopped. Danny emerged from cover, his rifle pointed at Victor but his face showing the agony of impossible choices. Victor laughed and said this was how it ended, with Danny choosing between his principles and the woman he loved. Catherine felt the knife press harder against her skin. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. She thought about being chained to that tree, about the weeks learning to fight alongside people who cared about justice. She thought about falling in love with Danny and discovering that her life could matter. She was not going to let Victor win. She was not going to be a victim anymore. Catherine drove her elbow backward into Victor's stomach with all her force. He gasped and the knife wavered. She spun in his grip and brought her knee up, breaking free from his hold. Victor stumbled backward and Danny fired. The shot hit Victor in the shoulder and he dropped his knife, screaming in pain and rage. Guards rushed to protect him, but the crew's concentrated fire drove them back. Kane Fletcher made a calculated decision. He grabbed Victor and dragged him toward one of the transports, recognizing a lost battle when he saw one. His mercenaries provided covering fire as they retreated. Danny wanted to pursue, but Catherine ran to him and told him to wait. She pulled out the recording pendant and showed him that it had captured everything. Victor's admission about using her as bait, his threats, his cruelty, all recorded in perfect clarity. But Catherine had one more card to play. During the chaos of the fight, she had accessed one of the guards' communication devices and uploaded the recording to every broadcast channel on Redstone Mesa. The entire settlement could hear Victor's voice admitting his crimes, hear him threaten to leave her chained to die, hear him laugh about using people as disposable resources. The audio played on repeat across every speaker in the settlement. Danny stared at Catherine in amazement. She had not just gathered evidence. She had already exposed Victor to everyone. The crew gathered around them as they watched Victor's convoy speed away toward the settlement. Kane's team retreated with him, their job effectively over. Nobody would pay to protect a man whose crimes were now public knowledge. Claire monitored the settlement's communication channels and reported that the colonial marshal had issued an arrest warrant for Victor. The workers in the settlement were rioting, demanding justice and reform. Danny pulled Catherine into his arms and held her tight. He told her she was brilliant and brave and absolutely terrifying when she wanted to be. Catherine laughed, giddy with relief and adrenaline. She said they made a good team. The crew celebrated their victory, but they all knew this was just the beginning. Victor still had resources and allies. The fight for real change on Redstone Mesa would take time and effort, but something fundamental had shifted. The people of the settlement had heard the truth. They knew what Victor really was, and they were angry. The corporate system that had seemed unbreakable had its first real crack. As dawn broke over the desert, Catherine stood with Danny and watched the settlement in the distance. Smoke rose from several buildings where the riots were spreading. The colonial authorities were scrambling to restore order. Change was coming to Redstone Mesa, messy and chaotic and necessary. Danny asked Catherine what she wanted to do now. She thought about the question carefully. Part of her wanted to run far away from this place and never look back. But another part, the part that had been forged in the desert heat and canyon shadows, wanted to stay and make sure the change actually happened. She told Danny they should stay, at least for a while. Someone needed to make sure Victor actually faced justice, that the reforms were real and not just empty promises. Danny agreed. They would stay and fight together. The crew started packing up their equipment, preparing to move to a safer location while they waited to see how events unfolded. Catherine took one last look at the abandoned mining station where everything had come to a head. This was where she had stopped being a victim and become someone who fought back. This was where her new life truly began.